The first thing Commander Rail noticed about the intruder was that nothing about him matched the Archive's records, because according to every empire in the Orion Coalition, humans did not exist, Earth was a myth, and any report claiming sightings of Homo sapiens was classified under hallucination, Warzone stress, or enemy misinformation, yet the man standing in the ruined trench looked painfully real, coated in ash, breathing hard, carrying something that looked like a field-welded rifle and eyes that glowed with a strange, animal focus, and Rail felt her throat tighten as the alarms wailed across Outpost Vekarus, because the Kroll Dominion was advancing through the smoke-filled valley with their four-legged war machines, and someone had just walked alone into the deadliest conflict zone in the sector. The stranger gave a faint nod, as if acknowledging her confusion, then stepped through the fractured shield barrier that should have incinerated any unregistered life form, and Rail whispered to her adjutant that the readings were impossible, because the barrier recognized him as one of theirs, as if the Coalition systems believed he belonged there, and before she could question him the stranger said in a calm, tired voice, "Which one of you called for help?" as if answering a question none of them had asked aloud. Then dropped a bag of scavenged ammunition on the ground like he had just returned from groceries instead of walking across an active battlefield, and Rail realized with a creeping chill that the man was wounded, bleeding through a torn jacket, yet moving with a predator's balance that unnerved every soldier around him. When she demanded his name he simply answered, Elias, and when she asked what world he hailed from his gaze flicked toward the burning horizon as he said, "One your maps say never existed." Before the outpost's deck shook violently as a Kroll artillery bolt slammed into the embankment, sending soldiers scattering and tearing open the forward bunker. The stranger didn't flinch. Instead he reached into his jacket and pulled out a triangular device unlike anything Rail had seen, humming with a frequency that made her implants glitch, and the Kroll war machines paused mid-stride as if something in the air disrupted their targeting systems. Rail's adjutant yelled that the enemy jammer arrays had gone offline, but she didn't believe for a second it was luck. Not when the stranger was walking straight toward the breach with the calmness of someone who had done this far too many times. Rail grabbed his arm, feeling the dense muscles coil like braided steel, and demanded to know who trained him, which military claimed him, and why he walked into a war zone carrying no insignia, no ID marker, and a device that behaved like both a shield and a weapon, and he looked at her with a haunted, almost exhausted expression as he replied, "I didn't come here to fight your war, Commander. I came because someone erased my home. And your enemies are the only ones who still remember what happened to us." Before stepping into the breach just as the Kroll mechs reactivated, their cannons glowing with charging plasma, Rail shouted for her squad to cover him, but the stranger didn't wait. He sprinted through the crater as the ground erupted behind him, leaping onto the mech's frontal plate before firing a point-blank burst into its optical array, then drove the triangular device into its armored spine, causing the entire machine to collapse like its bones had liquefied. Even the Kroll soldiers recoiled in shock as the human used the crumbling mech as cover, sliding under its falling chassis and emerging with its plasma core in hand, ripping open the detonation chamber before hurling the core at the second mech, triggering an implosive collapse that sucked the machine into its own gravitational field. And Rail could only stare as the battlefield fell silent, smoke swirling around the lone figure standing amid two destroyed machines, his silhouette outlined in the flickering embers. When he returned to the outpost, soldiers backed away instinctively, not in fear, but in the ancient reflex one reserved for apex predators whose species the Coalition insisted had never existed. Rail approached him slowly and asked again who he really was, and this time his answer was softer, heavier, carrying the weight of something unspeakable. "If the alien empires denied Earth's existence, Commander, then someone Went to great lengths to bury the truth, and I intend to find out why, even if it means tearing open every lie your galaxies have been built on. And Rael felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold winds of Vekarus, because she sensed this man was not just a survivor, he was the spark that would ignite a war the Coalition had spent centuries pretending did not exist. And when distant thunder rumbled across the battlefield, she realized with horror that it wasn't thunder at all, but war. Fleets dropping out of FTL one by one, responding to the presence of the one species the galaxy feared so deeply they chose to erase it from history instead of facing what it could become, and she whispered, "What have we done?" as the sky darkened. The warships descending through the storm-racked sky were like jagged shadows tearing open the clouds, and Rael felt the outpost tremble beneath her as the Krull Dominion's frontline carriers began dropping into low orbit, their hulls glowing with the faint red shimmer of active bombardment routines. Yet the stranger, Elias, stood on the shattered battlement as if watching distant fireworks, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning patterns the Coalition's scanners couldn't even register, and Rael's nerves tightened with every passing second because nothing in her training had prepared her for a human who wasn't supposed to exist analyzing a battlefield with the calm precision of someone who had survived a lifetime of extinction-level chaos. And when she asked how he knew the Krull were repositioning for a pincer strike, he simply replied that their energy formations were too focused on the ridge to be anything else, pointing toward faint distortions in the dust-filled air that only he seemed able to detect. And before she could question him further, the outpost received an encrypted hail from command demanding to know why an unidentified biped was interfering with military systems. But Rael muted the channel because she knew command would order Elias detained, and something told her that treating this man as a prisoner was the fastest route to catastrophic failure. Meanwhile, Elias crouched beside the trench, running a hand across the soil like someone feeling the pulse of a living creature, whispering something Rael couldn't hear, but whatever he sensed made his expression darken, and he rose with a slow, grim certainty that chilled her spine as he murmured, "They're not here for your outpost, they're here for me," which made no sense because the Krull Dominion didn't believe humans existed either. Yet the fear in his voice was not the fear of being hunted, but the fear of something much older, something that had already found him once. Moments later, a deep, resonant pulse rippled through the air, a frequency so low the outpost's metal supports vibrated, and Rael's adjutant yelled that it wasn't Krull technology, that something entirely different had entered the system from beyond conventional sensors, and Elias closed his eyes as if recognizing the sound like a cursed melody, saying, "That's not Krull. That's the thing that erased my colony," just before the entire sky flickered white, revealing a translucent veil of shifting glyphs etched across the clouds, symbols twisting like broken constellations before fading back into darkness. And Rael realized with dawning horror that this was no simple enemy force. They were in the center of a pursuit that had begun years before any of them were born. As the outpost scrambled defenses, Elias sat against a collapsed wall, exhaustion seeping into his posture, and Rael approached carefully, asking him to explain what he meant about Earth's erasure, and he described a colony, Nova Espera, founded by humans on the fringe of a forgotten arm, a world no Coalition database acknowledged, a world that taught children to grow crops under red suns, to outrun storms filled with shards of glass, to sleep lightly because predators learned the rhythm of their heartbeat. And Rael whispered in disbelief because the environmental profile he described matched near-death world conditions, meaning humans were either catastrophically unlucky or something in their physiology adapted to extreme conditions in ways the archive never recorded. Elias continued, talking about how the colony was thriving until the sky broke open one night and something came through, silent, invisible, bending starlight around itself, erasing entire districts without leaving bodies behind, without leaving debris, just clean geometrically perfect voids where life used to be. And Rael's stomach twisted because such a thing resembled classified extinction-level anomalies hidden deep in the Coalition's forbidden archives. Anomalies believed to be ancient myths or enemy propaganda, yet Elias spoke with the hollow certainty of someone who had watched the unimaginable devour his home, and he explained how the survivors fled into the forests, hunted for days until only a handful remained, and when rescue beacons failed and ships never arrived, he understood that someone, some empire or alliance, had buried Earth's existence on purpose. Rael wanted to dismiss it as trauma, but the conviction in his eyes was too sharp, too grounded, and before she could question him further, an explosion shook the outpost as the Krull infantry breached the east flank, forcing Rael to order squads into defensive formation. But Elias pushed himself up despite his injuries and told her to hold position because the Krull were not the primary threat, and when she demanded why, he shouted over the artillery that the Dominion forces were being used, manipulated, directed by something that treated them as bait or tools, not enemies. And as if proving him right, a sudden seismic jolt ripped through the battlefield, not caused by artillery but by displacement, a gravity shear that made the horizon bend unnaturally, and Rael screamed for the squad to fall back as a massive rift began forming in the sky, swirling like a luminous scar opening across the clouds, its edges peeling back to reveal an impossibly dark void beyond, and the Krull immediately halted their assault, retreating in panic disorder because even they recognized that something worse than humans, worse than the Coalition, worse than any known empire, had arrived. Elias staggered forward, staring at the rift with horror so raw Rael felt it like a physical blow, and he whispered, "It followed me," moments before an object emerged from the tear, smooth, elongated, shimmering like liquid metal but moving with the predatory silence of a ghost, scanning the battlefield with pulses of invisible radiation that made every implant glitch simultaneously. Rael forced her soldiers behind cover, but Elias remained exposed, breathing hard, hands shaking not out of fear but fury, and he muttered that the creature, if it could even be called a creature, was a Hunter-class sentinel, the same type that erased Nova Espera, and Rael's mind raced because such technology did not belong to any of the major empires, not even the forbidden ones, meaning this was something older. Something pre-galactic, something capable of wiping civilizations clean and leaving behind only myths. The Sentinel's gaze locked onto Elias, light rippling across its body, and Rael knew instantly it wasn't here for territory or conquest, it was here to eliminate a witness. The Krull Dominion, realizing the threat, unleashed a barrage of plasma fire at the Sentinel. But the machine absorbed every bolt without slowing, refracting the energy into harmless dispersal clouds. And before Rael could fire her own weapon, Elias grabbed her wrist with terrifying strength, telling her not to waste shots because conventional weapons would do nothing, and instead he rummaged through the wreckage for the triangular device he used earlier, hissing as he found it but noticing it had cracked, the energy core flickering unstable, and Rael pleaded with him not to use something so damaged because it could kill him, but Elias simply said, "It's not meant to keep me safe. It's meant to disrupt them." Before sprinting directly toward the descending Sentinel, Rael screamed after him, but he didn't stop, weaving through falling debris with inhuman precision, activating the device and sending waves of distorted radiation pulsing across the battlefield, momentarily pushing the Sentinel off balance and causing its scanning layers to fragment like shattered glass. And Rael's heart pounded because she realized Elias wasn't trying to kill it, he was buying time. Distracting it, drawing its attention away from the soldiers and onto himself, and the Sentinel responded with a beam of compressed gravity that tore gouges into the ground, sucking in debris and metal as if the battlefield were being carved open by an invisible blade. Elias barely dodged, rolling behind the remains of a Kroll mech, but the sentinel adjusted, closing the distance with terrifying speed. And Rael made a split-second decision, ordering her squad to open fire not at the machine but at the collapsing ridge above it, and for the first time the sentinel's movement faltered as boulders crashed down, momentarily burying it under tons of stone, giving Elias a chance to limp back toward the outpost, his breath ragged, blood soaking through his improvised bandages, and Rael caught him before he collapsed, demanding to know if the sentinel would return, and Elias whispered, "It never stops." Just as the rubble behind them shifted, glowing cracks spreading through the stone as the sentinel began to rise again with murderous intent, Rael shouted for evacuation, but Elias grabbed her collar, pulling her close with more strength than any wounded man should have, and said, "You don't understand, Commander. This is only the first one," and Rael froze, realizing the implication. More would follow, entire swarms of them. And the sky above them echoed with new gravitational distortions forming like thunderheads before a storm, and as the first fractures tore open in the clouds. Elias looked up with broken, exhausted rage and whispered, "This is how my colony died," ending the chapter with the world around them shaking apart. The sky tore open like a wound, leaking light and darkness at the same time, and Rael felt her heartbeat stutter as gravitational fractures rippled outward from the forming rifts, warping the air so violently that the outpost's metallic structures bent, groaned, and folded as if crushed by an invisible giant hand, while Elias staggered forward despite his injuries, staring at the expanding tiers with an expression Rael had never seen before, neither fear nor shock, but a grim recognition that carried the weight of someone who had lived inside this nightmare once already and barely escaped its jaws. And as the first sentinel clawed free from the rubble behind them, glowing with the eerie, fluid luminescence of a creature built from physics humanity was never meant to understand, Rael pulled Elias behind cover, demanding to know how many were coming, but Elias, breathing hard, eyes glassy with pain and dread, whispered that the first time he saw the sky open like this, 37 rifts formed, and only 5 humans survived the next 12 hours, and even those 5 were not saved, they were simply hunted last, and something inside Rael snapped because this was no longer a war between empires, no longer a skirmish for territory, but an extermination event repeating itself, and they were standing in the center of it. The Kroll troops, once fierce and relentless in their assault, were now scrambling in panic, abandoning their assault positions and firing wildly at the sentinels as more began emerging, their forms shifting from liquid silver to jagged crystalline frames as they adapted to atmospheric density, and Rael watched entire Kroll platoons vanish, not killed, not vaporized, but unmade, reduced to outlines of dust that crumbled into nothing seconds later, causing her soldiers to tremble because they realized no amount of courage or training could prepare anyone for an enemy that didn't simply kill but erased. Elias pushed himself upright, ignoring Rael's pleas for him to rest, and he moved toward the central comms tower, saying they had one chance, only one, to warn the coalition before the rifts expanded beyond containment, but the moment he reached the base of the tower, an electromagnetic shockwave tore through the entire outpost, shorting every display, bursting lights, and frying most implants, leaving only analog systems functional. And Rael cursed because this meant the sentinels were deploying suppression fields, cutting off escape routes and communication paths, just like they did on Nova Espera. Elias braced himself on the tower frame, wincing as sparks crackled overhead, telling Rael that if they could power the old emergency broadcaster on the ridge, they might send a short-range burst before the field stabilized, but reaching it required crossing open terrain now crawling with sentinels that moved with predatory silence. Their bodies refracting light one moment and becoming pitch-black silhouettes the next, like glitches in reality. Still, Rael ordered her remaining squad to gather, and together they sprinted across the debris-strewn courtyard, weaving between collapsing structures and the smoldering remains of Kroll vehicles, while Elias followed behind, limping but alert, his gaze constantly scanning for distortions only he could detect. And twice he shoved Rael aside just in time to avoid a gravity spike that would have folded her armor inward like paper, as they reached the half-demolished ridge. Bunker. Rael's adjutant managed to power the emergency broadcaster using a scavenged kinetic battery, but the moment the system hummed to life, the temperature around them plummeted as a sentinel materialized inches from Elias, its smooth metallic surface shifting into a jagged spear aimed directly at his chest, and Rael screamed as she fired her rifle point-blank. Knowing it would do little but hoping for even a second of disruption, the blast hit, refracting into a cascade of harmless sparks. But that momentary flicker gave Elias the chance to slam his cracked disruption device against the Sentinel's core, and the resulting detonation sent a shockwave of distorted spacetime rippling outward, hurling everyone to the ground while the Sentinel convulsed violently, its form unraveling like liquid metal being sucked through a black hole before collapsing into a pool of inert silver dust. Rael crawled toward Elias, who was lying motionless, chest rising shallowly, the device smashed beyond repair in his hand, and before she could check his injuries, her adjutant shouted that the broadcaster had successfully sent a burst, but only partially, because the rifts were amplifying interference, meaning command might receive fragments or nothing at all. Elias groaned, stirring weakly, whispering that it didn't matter, because even if the coalition came, they wouldn't be fighting to save the outpost. They'd be fighting to survive, and as Rael listened, she noticed something she hadn't before. The sentinels were no longer advancing. Instead they were repositioning in concentric patterns, forming a perimeter around the ridge, as if preparing for something bigger, something beyond their extermination protocol, and the air thickened with a pressure that made Rael's ears ring, her vision blur, as a massive structure began forming above the battlefield, a colossal geometric shape materializing in slow, dreadful increments, its surface layered with symbols identical to the ones Elias described from his childhood, symbols that flickered like dying stars. Rael's soldiers stared in horror, and Elias pushed himself into a sitting position, fighting dizziness, whispering, "The Harvester, it's here," and Rael's blood ran cold because the word alone carried a weight of legend, rumor, forbidden archive logs that described planet-scale events, the consumption of entire worlds by something that left no survivors. No ruins, no energy signatures, nothing but a blank page in cosmic history. And as the giant shadow fully emerged through the rift, descending with the unstoppable certainty of a cosmic executioner, Rael realized the chapter wasn't ending with their survival, it was ending with the truth. This was not a war zone they had stumbled into, this was a massacre repeating itself, and Elias Hale was the only reason it had come again. The Harvester descended with a slow, inevitable gravity that made the entire ridge tremble as if the world itself feared what was coming, its colossal geometric frame rotating in segments that moved independently, each layer shifting like an ancient lock being undone, and Rael felt her pulse unravel as the pressure in the air thickened until breathing felt like inhaling molten metal, while Elias, pale and trembling from blood loss, forced himself to stand despite his wounds because he knew what the Harvester meant. He had seen its shadow once before on the day Earth vanished from every archive, every sensor grid, every galactic database, erased so thoroughly that most empires convinced themselves humans were myths, but Elias remembered watching the sky rip open above his home and the world buckle under the weight of something no species had ever survived, and now it hovered over Vekarus with the same slow, deliberate hunger. Soldiers across the outpost stared upward in horror as the harvester's underside opened like a mechanical iris, revealing a swirling vortex of energy that pulsed with a rhythm disturbingly similar to a heartbeat, and Rael felt her bones vibrate with each pulse until she tasted iron and ozone on her tongue, realizing that the machine wasn't merely preparing to fire, it was synchronizing with the planet's magnetic field, aligning for extraction, and she shouted for her troops to fall back, though she knew there was nowhere to run because the harvester didn't target armies, it devoured worlds. The sentinels surrounding the ridge shifted suddenly, forming rigid lines as if responding to some invisible command, and Elias grabbed Rael's arm, his voice raw as he said that what was happening now was exactly how the sequence began on the day Earth was taken, and Rael demanded to know how he survived if his entire planet was erased, but Elias shook his head, saying he didn't survive Earth's fall, he survived its aftermath, waking days later in the ruins of a refugee vessel that had been flung thousands of light-years off course, with every log burned clean, every navigation system wiped, and every mention of Earth overwritten with a blank string, as if the universe itself refused to remember humanity. Before Rael could process his words, the harvester emitted a resonant hum that shook the ridge so violently cracks split across the ground, swallowing trenches and scattering debris, and the vortex above them brightened from white to a deep, predatory blue, creating a gravitational pull that dragged small rocks into the air, then helmets, then entire crates, sending them spiraling upward into the light, and Rael's soldiers anchored themselves to the bunker frame as the wind whipped around them with hurricane force. Elias staggered toward the emergency broadcaster, saying that if they could amplify the earlier burst and shift its frequency, they might force the coalition to intercept the signal manually, but the sentinels sensed their movement and converged at terrifying speed, flowing across the battlefield like liquid steel, their limbs elongating into bladed tendrils designed for swift planetary sterilization, and Rael fired until her rifle overheated while her squad launched grenades and pulse rounds that barely slowed the advancing wave. One sentinel broke through the line and lunged directly at Elias, but instead of retreating he stepped forward with a calm defiance that startled even Rael, placing his hand on the jagged tendril, and the moment the creature touched him, its entire body convulsed violently as if struck by a force it didn't know how to counter, collapsing into a molten puddle at his feet, and Rael stared in disbelief as Elias whispered that the Sentinel's core logic recognized him, not as prey, but as an anomaly, something they had encountered once before and failed to classify. Another shockwave erupted overhead, and the harvester's iris widened further, revealing the faint outline of structures inside, thousands of chambers like glass cells, some glowing faintly, others dark, arranged in a massive spiral that stretched deeper than should be physically possible, and Rael realized with a creeping horror that the harvester wasn't simply a weapon, it was a vault, and the cells weren't conduits or power cores, they were containers, and something was inside them. Elias swayed, clutching his side, whispering that when he was young, he remembered flashes, faces trapped behind translucent walls, frozen in time, preserved as the harvester pulled Earth apart piece by piece, not destroying but dissecting, cataloging, storing, and Rael felt sick as she asked if humans were still inside it, and Elias shook his head violently, saying it took everything. Not just people, not just cities, but memories, records, artifacts, imprints of consciousness, stripping the identity of a species until even the galaxy forgot it ever existed. The ground buckled again as more sections of the harvester unfolded, and Rail ordered her team to fall back into the bunker, but before they could move, the ridge exploded in a burst of blue-white energy that hurled them into the air, scattering them across the fractured terrain while a deep, resonant tone vibrated through every molecule around them. Rail crawled through dust and debris, calling out to Elias, spotting him barely conscious near the shattered broadcaster, its components sparking and melting under the gravitational stress. And when she reached him, he gripped her wrist with surprising strength, whispering that something else was coming through the rift, something worse than the Sentinels or the Harvester itself, a presence he remembered only as a shadow, a silhouette etched into the last memory of his home before everything went black. And Rail felt her skin crawl as the vortex above them split down the center, revealing a towering figure stepping through, its form shifting between humanoid and monstrous, its eyes burning like twin singularities, and Elias breathed a single word dripping with terror and recognition, architect, and Rail realized the story of humanity's disappearance had never been about extinction, it had been about abduction, experiment, and something far more ancient than the Harvester, something that had just set foot onto Vekarus. The architect stepped fully out of the vortex with a grace that contradicted its impossible size, its silhouette shifting in ways that defied dimension, as though its body existed in more than one plane at once, and every soldier who looked at it felt their knees buckle as their minds struggled to comprehend what they were seeing, because its very presence carried weight. An ancient authority that pressed against their thoughts like a hand gripping the back of their skulls. Rail forced herself upright despite the ringing in her ears, raising her rifle even though she knew instinctively that no weapon forged by organic hands could harm something like this, and beside her Elias choked on a breath as he whispered that he remembered the architect's voice from the day Earth fell, a voice that didn't speak in sound but in command. A voice that told the Sentinels what to take, what to erase, and what to preserve. And as the architect's burning eyes locked onto him, a ripple passed through the Harvester overhead, its iris contracting in obedience, its chambers reorienting like a giant machine recognizing its master. The ground trembled as the architect lifted a hand, and every Sentinel on the battlefield immediately froze mid-movement, then bowed. Actual mechanical submission, before dissolving into liquid metal that slithered back toward the Harvester as though being recalled, and Rail, horrified, realized they had never been the threat, only the tools, because the true danger had just arrived. Elias staggered to his feet, fury cutting through his pain as he shouted that Earth wasn't destroyed, that humanity wasn't extinct but stolen, dissected, archived, turned into a collection, and the architect tilted its head slightly, studying him as though examining a faulty specimen, a flicker of something like recognition passing through its shifting face as it spoke directly into their minds with a voice that felt like cold metal sliding behind their eyes, telling Elias that he was not meant to survive, that the anomaly of his existence was a statistical error that would now be corrected. Rail grabbed Elias and pulled him back as the air around them warped violently, forming a sphere of crushing gravity that disintegrated anything it touched, and she dragged him behind a fractured outcrop as the architect advanced, each footstep sending shockwaves through the ridge, while overhead the Harvester's iris spiraled open further, revealing entire layers of the vault glowing to life as if awakening after centuries of dormancy. Elias coughed blood but pushed himself upright again, shouting that the architect wasn't studying species, it was curating them, building a perfect archive of galactic evolution by consuming planets and storing their civilizations like samples in a cosmic museum, erasing them afterward to maintain purity of catalog. And Rail felt her stomach twist as she realized the magnitude of what they were facing, not a conqueror, not a machine, but something more akin to a librarian of extinction, an entity that believed preservation required annihilation, The architect raised its hand again and a beam of compressed silence streaked toward them, bending the air as it came, but Elias stepped in front of Rael instinctively and the beam shattered against him like glass hitting stone, sending fragments of fractured energy scattering across the rubble. And Rael stared in stunned disbelief as the architect recoiled, its form flickering, clearly shocked, because Elias, just a wounded human, had resisted an attack meant to erase him from existence. Elias gasped, gripping his chest, saying he wasn't resisting, the harvester was, that something inside the vault recognized him, responded to him, protected him, because humanity's essence wasn't fully catalogued, the process was incomplete, and the archive didn't allow destruction of unfinished entries. The architect spoke again, its tone sharp with irritation, the air vibrating with its anger. As it declared that Earth had malfunctioned, that human consciousness had resisted integration, fracturing the catalog and generating anomalies like Elias, and Rael saw realization dawn across Elias's face as he whispered that humanity wasn't gone, it was trapped, millions of voices suspended inside the harvester, unfinished, unintegrated, waiting, before the architect could strike again. The harvester itself pulsed violently, its chambers glowing white-hot as though rejecting its master, and the vortex above twisted into a chaotic storm that destabilized the ridge, sending chunks of earth spiraling into the air. The architect roared, not in sound but in psychic force, as it reached toward the harvester, trying to override it, and Elias grabbed Rael's hand, shouting that this was their only chance, that the malfunction was spreading, that if they could overload the harvester's core by forcing it to complete the corrupted human entry, they could collapse the entire archival system and free whatever remained of his species. Rael didn't understand how, but she ran with him toward the collapsing broadcaster, dodging shards of reality-bent metal as the architect clawed at the sky, trying to stabilize the vortex, and Elias ripped open the cracked console, hot sparks burning his skin as he jammed both hands into the exposed node, screaming as raw energy surged through him like liquid lightning. The harvester responded instantly, its entire structure warping as chambers opened, revealing millions of suspended consciousnesses flickering like stars trapped in crystal, their collective pulse resonating through Elias as his body lifted off the ground, suspended in a sphere of blinding light, and Rael shielded her eyes as the architect turned toward him in panic, realizing too late what he was doing, diving forward to stop him. But the harvester erupted in a shockwave of white fire that engulfed the ridge and sky alike, swallowing the architect, the sentinels, the vortex, and Elias himself. And when the light faded seconds or centuries later, Rael couldn't tell. The harvester was gone, the sky clear, the battlefield silent, leaving only scorched earth and drifting ash where everything else had been, and Rael collapsed to her knees, wondering whether Elias had died, ascended, or become part of something far larger, and whether humanity had been freed or lost forever inside a machine older than empires. But as she stared at the empty sky, a faint whisper brushed her mind, Elias's voice, soft but unmistakably human, saying, "We're not gone, we're waking up."